Hello. Thank you so much for being here today. This panel is organized by the Freedom Project and the Provost Office. And we have three distinguished new University in Exile Consortium fellows with us today here. Ayşen Candaş, Teng Biao, and Kian Taşbaş, who are unfortunately persecuted and exiled from their home countries, China, Iran, and Turkey. Before presenting our panelists, I would like to introduce the new University in Exile Consortium. And they are also joining, the consortium fellows are now joining us through the online seminar program that they use. So we have some virtual audience here too. As well as the college is a founding member of the new University in Exile Consortium, I think it's nice to introduce the consortium a little bit. Currently, the consortium has 18 members, 18 universities and colleges. All of them host exiled scholars, unfortunately coming from all around the world, including Syria, Turkey, Brazil, Azerbaijan, India, China, Cambodia, Iran, Iraq, Ukraine. So the fellows are coming from a diverse group of countries, which is an unfortunate sign of the grim global trend of the curtailment of academic freedoms all around the world, as well as the widespread nature of the attacks on the intellectuals all around the world. The consortium itself is a remake of the University in Exile that was established in 1933 at the New School for Social Research, which hosted scholars, European scholars, running away, fleeing the Nazi Germany. And right now, the consortium itself, the new version of the new University in Exile Consortium, hosts scholars to provide them a safe haven in their new intellectual homes, and trying to also create a network of exiled scholars in the United States. So without further ado, I also would like to introduce our panelists today. Our first panelist, Ayşen Candaş, holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. And she was a faculty member of Boğaziçi University in Turkey, and she is a peace academic. She had to resign from her tenured position in Turkey in 2019. She has conducted research and published various articles on the trajectory of basic rights and democracy in Turkey, the impact of new laws and policies on equality and the liberties of various groups, shifts in the aim of social policy in Turkey, constitutional politics in Turkey, and the rights of women and sexual, ethnic, and religious minorities in Turkey. She is currently a visiting lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Yale University. Our second panelist today is Teng Biao. He is an academic lawyer, currently Gere Human Rights Fellow at the Hunter College. He held positions at China University of Politics and Law, Yale, Harvard, NYU, and Institute of Advanced Study. His research focuses on criminal justice, human rights, social movements, and political transition in China. He co-founded two human rights organizations in China, namely the Open Constitution Initiative and China Against the Death Penalty. He is one of the earliest promoters of the rights defense movement in China. And he received various human rights awards, including the Human Rights Prize of the French Republic in 2007. Finally, our final speaker is Kian Taşbaş. He also holds a PhD from Columbia University, and he is now a senior advisor to the executive vice president for global centers and global development at Columbia University. Between 2016 and 2019, he was a professor of urban planning at Columbia. His research interests fall into two areas of comparative study of global urbanization, with a focus on local democracy, and he also studies international relations focusing on competing paradigms of world order. He is currently completing a book on local democracy and state building in modern Iran. He was among the pro-democracy protesters, pro-democracy activists arrested and detained by the Iranian government during the Green Movement in 2009. And after several years under house arrest, He was one of the 5 Iranian-American dual citizens whose release was negotiated under the Iran nuclear deal, signed in 2016 by the Obama administration. He is a prolific writer, and his works appeared in many places, including the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, the Wilson Quarterly, and the New York Times. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our panelists. And I also would like to express that as a New University in Exile Consortium fellow myself, despite the grim situation, despite how unfortunate the initial conditions are, I am honored to be among such distinguished fellows. And please join me in welcoming them.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Najan, for your invitation, and I'm honored to be here to talk about this very interesting and important topics. Can the United States export the First Amendment? Yeah, it's a perfect time to ask this question when the United States really needs to defend the First Amendment because of Donald Trump. So my answer to this question might be yes and no. No, because the First Amendment is very American. Freedom of expression in other constitutions is like articulated very differently. And 2 examples, the German criminal law prohibits symbols that are strongly identified with the Nazi party or the neo-Nazi organizations. And Holocaust denial is punishable in Germany and some other countries, but not in the United States. And second, Texas versus Johnson in 1989. So the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated the prohibitions on desecrating the American flag, which at that time were in force in 48 states. So in the United States, burning American flag is protected as freedom of expression by the First Amendment. But it's illegal in most other countries, which are widely regarded as free countries. But if we ask, can the United States export the basic principle of freedom of expression? My answer would be yes, because A, freedom of expression is universal. B, exporting freedom of expression is in the interest of the United States. C, the United States has moral responsibility to do so. And D, the United States has the ability and influence power to do so. But today I'll be focusing on how the Chinese government threatened global freedom of expression. Most of us know the brazen violation of freedom of expression in China. China is the biggest prison of bloggers, journalists, and writers. Many bloggers and human rights activists were put into prison because their articles, their interviews, their writings like that. And just a few days ago, my friend Xu Zhiyong, who is a leading human rights activist in China, was arrested because he organized a dinner seminar in Xiamen, and then 6 activists were arrested only because that's activity. And Xu Zhiyong had been detained for a few times. So it's many human rights lawyers were rounded up in 2009 because their defense work that if you defend like a dissident in the trial court, and then a human rights lawyer can be arrested, detained, and tortured. And in China, millions of websites are blocked by the GFW, the Great Firewall. And China is one of the 3 or 4 countries which blocked Google, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Last month, Turkey lifted a ban on Wikipedia, and then China became the only country that people can't access to Wiki. But not many people realize that China is a threat to our freedom of speech here in the United States, in the West, in other countries. Yesterday, 3 Wall Street Journal journalists were expelled by Chinese government. Reportedly, the reason is an op-ed written by another professor, like Columbia professor. So I sent one of the 3 journalists a message. He's my friend. So I said, this is a firm proof that you have been doing correct and important work. And it's really worrying if you do something and then you got punished, and then you think twice. But if you do something and then your colleagues, your family members, your friends would be punished, and then it's really difficult. And what are you going to do? Maybe help silence your colleagues or your family? Many people might think that being expelled from China is not so serious, but it's more severe than it seems to be. That many years of studying Chinese language or culture, building the network in China, and strengthening the experience and the skills of working in a very special situation, in a very special system. And that's why self-censorship is widespread. And it is more problematic among Western scholars. And Professor Perry Link famously said China is like the anecdote in the chandelier. And many scholars related to China study practice self-censorship. If they read something critical of Chinese Communist Party, if they study something on human rights and other sensitive topics, Tibetan, Xinjiang concentration camps, Tiananmen massacre, Falun Gong, like that, and then it's very likely your visa would be denied. And if you can't go to China, and if you are a scholar, a professor on Chinese law, politics, society, literature, and then your research, your position, your fund, and so your authority, everything would be jeopardized. And so Perry Link, Andrew Nathan, and many other prominent scholars are not allowed to go to China. And also international students gave up their themes of dissertation. So Perry Link told a story. One of his students want to study something like sensitive, but he finally gave it up because if they want to get a job in China, if they want to continue their academic work related to China, and then you can't research on this topic, or you can't be critical of Chinese government. And a few years ago, when I was a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, I got an invitation from ABA, American Bar Association, and they invited me to write a book on my experience, my thoughts on human rights and society in China. And then I signed that agreement. But very soon they rescinded the proposal. And they sent me an email saying that to publish my book will put their programs in China in danger. So that's a typical case of self-censorship. I also had the experience that my scheduled talk was canceled by an Ivy League university. Last November, I'm supposed on a panel on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet and China's human rights. And then because of the pressure of CSSA, that's a Chinese student group called Chinese Students and Scholars Association. So many universities have this CSSA. And then because of their protest, their threat to protest, and the Columbia University canceled that panel discussion. So the CSSA protest told the university they will organize a protest against this panel. A few years ago, I think it's 2 years ago, UCSD, University of California at San Diego, invited Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, to give a speech. But they got protest from CSSA, and they said they demanded the university to require Dalai Lama not to mention politics, and the university should refrain from describing Dalai Lama as a spiritual leader or in exile. After that speech, as a retaliation, Chinese government decided not to send official scholars and students, like officially funded scholars and students to UCSD. In a Canada university, Macaster University, CSSA intimidated and attacked a Uyghur speaker when she was talking about the concentration camps in Xinjiang. Confucius Institute. So this is an institute sponsored and funded and controlled by Chinese government, the Ministry of Education. So and they have in the United States there used to be 110 Confucius Institute, and now here we still have more than 90 Confucius Institute. And the Confucius Institutes have harmed academic freedom through selecting teachers and textbooks and training teachers, brainwashing lecturers, and preventing sensitive speakers from being invited and sensitive topics being discussed. So it seems, so they said, Chinese government said the Confucius Institute are institution focusing on Chinese language and culture study, but actually they don't function as a language institute. It's used to harm academic freedom and free speech in the United States in focusing on like campus. Movies, Hollywood. You may know Richard Gere is an international well-known star. He was starring in Pretty Woman, Chicago, and Primary Fear. Because after he became very active, very supportive Tibetan cause and Dalai Lama, Hollywood mainstream movies refused to take him. So he was not invited to act in any the mainstream movie. And because of the pressure of that from Chinese government, or because the Hollywood wants to enter China, want to earn money in the huge Chinese market, many Hollywood movies change their plot, their characters like that, like Red Dawn, Cloud Atlas, World War II, Iron Man 3, Man in Black 3. So all these movies were substantially altered. And in the superhero movie, Doctor Strange, the main character originated from Tibet, but to like Koto to Chinese market, it was changed from Tibetan to Celtic. And business. Last year, Marriott, the hotel chain, Marriott Twitter account had a like by a Tibetan organization. So and then Chinese government and Chinese little pinks were very angry, and after the pressure, Marriott fired Roy Jones, who is a manager of Marriott social media and American Citizen. And NBA. Maury is the general manager of Houston Rockets. And he tweeted out an image that voiced the support for Hong Kong democracy movement. And LeBron James and others publicly criticized Maury. And China started boycotting Houston Rockets. And I just finished a report on the Western companies practicing self-censorship and even facilitating China's censorship and surveillance, like Cisco, like Facebook, Google. Google last year had a project like Dragonfly. It's like a censored search engine. And Cisco provided equipment and technology to Chinese government to tighten the GFW. Actually, it established by Cisco, the Great Firewall system. Media. Last year, Hoover Institute, 2 years ago, Hoover Institute published a report. It found that almost every Chinese language media had been controlled by Chinese government, or partly controlled by the Communist Party, except a few like Falun Gong media, so the media like CGT and the Xinhua News Agency, like Chinese. China Radio or China Daily. So these are not media. So people said these are media from China, but that's not true. These are not media. They are propaganda machine, and they are like an influence and intelligence operations in the West. So 2 days ago, the State Department of the United States told China these 5 news agencies, including Xinhua and the CGTN, will officially be treated as foreign government functionaries, subject to FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And social media, like WeChat is very popular in China, and many foreigners use WeChat too. And I did a test a few days ago, the Wuhan coronavirus. I posted something about it, and then my if you register your WeChat in the United States, and you can read it. But if you register your WeChat with a Chinese telephone number, and then you can't read it. Yeah, that's what WeChat does. And Western universities in China, the NYU, Duke University, Johns Hopkins, Nottingham University, have branches, campuses in China. So is it an effort to export the first department? It seems so, but what they want is just money. So they argue that they have academic freedom in China, even though they know China has no academic freedom in Chinese campus. But it's kind of self-deception. My argument is that even though the teachers feel free to talk about anything, but the students in this campus, the NYU Shanghai, they can't join the conversation because if they talk about Falun Gong or Tiananmen, they'll be reported to Chinese government. So Chinese government has greatly harmed the news, the information, and theories related to China that you receive every day. Then your images, your opinion of China or Chinese Communist Party have been influenced or even shaped and because of the media, the self-censorship, all these things I just talked about. And it matters a lot because you are or will be an entrepreneur, a lawyer, a journalist, or a professor, or a politician. And because of my human rights work, I was banned from teaching, and my passport was confiscated. I was kidnapped and disappeared and tortured. And when I was in detention, I told myself, so to achieve free speech in China would be my lifetime dream. Now I'm in the United States, and I wish I can join you in defending the first amendment in this country against China and against maybe Donald Trump. And yes, the United States can and should export the principle of freedom of expression to China and elsewhere in this world. Thank you.
All right. It will be very difficult to add something to Teng's presentation. I always learn so much from Teng. Mine will be very political sciencey. I modified the question we were asked to render it compatible with what I've been studying for the past few years. I'm trying to compare Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Russia in terms of their characteristics, and it allows me to look at political religion and ideology in a new way, because in all these countries, there is impact of political religion and ideology, but the religions are different. So it gives me to de-essentialize also Islam's impact while also emphasizing political ideology. So the question I'm going to try to answer is why First Amendment rights are not only not relevant to autocracies, but canaries in the coal mine. And the short answer that I'm going to provide for this question, step by step, is that autocracies and populisms often emerge out of constitutional democracies, and rising autocracies challenge basic freedoms protected by constitutional states and liberal democratic systems. First Amendment rights are not only about civil liberties, but are also about the constraining role of the fourth estate, meaning the press, media, and civil society. So we're not merely talking about civil liberties when we talk about civil liberties, we're also talking about their constraining role. And autocracies, due to their nature, and I'm going to explain what autocracy is, cannot allow free speech. Opposed to liberal and rational discussions, they cannot tolerate debates that might challenge their authority, like open deliberations on policy issues, centralizing control. Autocracies do whatever is necessary to destroy what democratic societies rely on, namely an inclusive public sphere that relies on commonly shared facts and norms. So as long as autocracies continue to consolidate themselves in contexts such as Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, increasingly also Poland is joining the gang, the First Amendment-based rights, as they are understood in constitutional democracies, have no relevance. On the contrary, these countries would try to export their illiberal understandings to United States rather than embracing those ideas and ideals. So another related question is, why do populist autocrats target First Amendment rights and rights related to this amendment from the very beginning when they first come to power? To answer that question in a short way, I found this description of democracy, which I think is brilliant, in a very recently published, not even published, Stanford political science paper, Gere, Luders, and Myrick, 2019. They are saying 3 freedoms: freedom of choice, freedom from tyranny, and equality in freedom are guaranteed to all members of a democratic polity by 3 arenas that lead the function of electing, constraining, and enabling. We're speaking about, again, public sphere. Now, these political liberties, civil and political liberties, are protected by the First Amendment in the United States, and they are the core values of constitutional democracies elsewhere. Now, given the aims of autocracies, they must break these 3 arenas of democratic politics, the elect, constrain, and enable functions, which in turn requires undermining the free media, free speech, and civil and political liberties in general. That's why journalists and academics committed to democratic freedoms are the first to get criminalized in those contexts. And when they do, together with members of ethnic and religious minorities within those contexts, they serve as the canaries in the coal mine. They are the first to die, warning those who are paying attention that the political regime is changing. Now, another thing I think that's less understood in that dynamic of populism turning autocracy is that the question, do autocrats categorically hate the media, journalists and academics? Now, on the contrary, they have to divide and rule the media and the academy. So they rely on a loyal type of media, and they have to rely on a new loyal kind of academia in order to distribute fake news on the one hand, and in order to create the new official ideology. So they have to rely on these loyal, newly generated media and academia, and criminalize the honest ones who want to perpetuate whatever they supported as civil and political freedoms. So I can give you an example. I was a very mainstream studying civil and political liberties, procedural democracy type of person. So when Turkey begins to go crazy, here I am standing in the same place, but suddenly what I was studying, rule of law, which is very mainstream thing, right? It suddenly became something extremely political. So what can help, if not rescue, First Amendment rights in already autocratic countries? I think an international environment that does not support autocrats would be very helpful. Now, I would like to take a step back and remind you that these regime changes are real. Typically, populism studies talk about narrative and rhetoric of populism, but I think it's a misnomer to call these regimes populisms. It's to remind you how far we have come in the course of the last 15 years. Here's an excerpt from Wall Street Journal, published in 2003, written by Professor Timothy Garton Ash of Oxford University, who was then the director of the European Studies program there. And he is reflecting in 2003 on how Europe would be like in 2023, 20 years from then, when he's reflecting. And 2 sentences will jump at you. From the vision of this cosmopolitan, pluralist, wonderful professor reflecting on the euphoria of 2003 on the next 20 years. First sentence is, I want you to see, he's imagining in 2023, Europe is imagining whether it should accept Iraq as a full-fledged member of the Union. And from the second sentence that I highlighted there, you'll see Turkey has been a full-fledged member of the EU by 2013. And that really was where we were in 2003. And of course, since that time, professors UK is no longer part of Europe through Brexit. European Studies program, I don't know what they are going to do about that one. Turkey fell into autocracy. Hungary and increasingly Poland are joining the camp there. So, but that was the continuation of that 1989 moment when Fukuyama famously published this national interest essay, infamous essay, on the end of history and the victory of liberal democracies everywhere. So Garton Ash's point about Europe as a rising power was a continuation of that euphoria. But that 1989 moment was really sitting on an academic scandal, that euphoria moment, which was the fact that Sovietologists, who were, after all, with all these fellowships and funds, were studying Soviet model, and they couldn't foresee when it happened in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed. They had no idea that that was happening. So Brexit, people who couldn't understand what's happening to Turkey and couldn't predict what was happening to Turkey. All of these are a continuation of failure of us political scientists in predicting what's happening around the world. In 1993, eminent political philosopher at Columbia University then, Giovanni Sartori, publishes this wonderful article where he makes 2 points about that scandal of Sovietologists. First, and I think both points are still relevant in our world today, that's why I'm bringing it up. The first one, he argued, this model mania, our obsession with deductive reasoning in order to, looking at the world in order to prove our models, rather than looking at the world in order to see what's really taking place. If we keep continuing to do that in the future as well, we're going to fail predicting what's going to happen in the world. That's his first point. And his second point was, which I think is very important, he says, because immediately in 1989, these political scientists got rid of totalitarianism as a political regime classification out of the political regime classifications. And they begin to work with a binary model. Something is either democracy or authoritarian, in that sense, binary model. And as a result of which, Sartori warns, we are loading what democracy means or diluting it, depending on how you look at it. And you're also doing the same thing and rendering authoritarianism less specific than it should be. Keeping totalitarianism as a third, what he called Weberian ideal type, polar type, in that political regime classification, he argued, is going to allow us to watch the country's movement in a spectrum and to understand whether they are getting worse or better. But nobody listened to Sartori, as you can expect, and we saw in the next 2-3 decades proliferation of democracy with adjectives that were not really democracies, so you had to use qualifiers to describe them. Delegative democracy, tutelary democracy, those types. And then Collier and Levitsky famously published a paper on that, calling them democracy with adjectives. But we also saw in recent decade a proliferation of authoritarianisms with adjectives, such as competitive authoritarian, electoral authoritarian. We have to, try to qualify in order to specify what these mean, and we still deny the possibility that some of these countries that we're marking as autocrat today might turn fascist and totalitarian in the future. So that's what I want to leave on the table. So I think historical institutionalism as a perspective made two contributions to political science that we should take at heart. The first one is institutions are not merely formal, they are also informal. So norms and rules and values are also institutions. Once these begin to change in a collectivity, it means there is institutional change. That's their first contribution. The second contribution I think they made is to teach us not to look at institutions in isolation, but to look at the macro context where various institutions interact with one another in intended and unintended manner, and creating a variety of consequences that some of which might be intended and some of which might be unintended. So going back to my question, is regime change merely a question of changes in government, as we have been claiming since the victory of that liberal democratic model in 1989? We've been assuming political regime is changing government, but really political regime transformation is a state's capture and its reorganization. So we have to understand what a state is. It's not merely government, and it doesn't change through elections merely. Using Franz Neumann of Frankfurt School, his analysis of the state from 1940s, I'm going to argue we have to think of those 6 institutions when we think of a state. The first 3 you'll recognize as the powers: legislature, executive branch, and judiciary. And then you have civilian and military bureaucracy and the police force. Now, what happens during a transition, I think, can be expressed in 7 points. First is a personalization and privatization of political authority takes place. This is the technical definition of autocracy from a Weberian perspective. If you remember, if you're familiar with Weber, in his Economy and Society, he talked about 3 types of legitimacy or authority or domination. Traditional, people owing allegiance to a order due to the fact that those rules were there from time immemorial, he said. Second type of legitimacy is charismatic or charisma. People owe allegiance to an order because they think the person, the leader, embodies supernatural qualities. And the third one is the modern state, he thought, belonged to the particularly modern period, and it refers to the legal rational authority, which underlines the order, impersonal order, that people owe allegiance to because they believe in the validity of these norms and values that are embodied in that legal rational order. Now, so in other words, what's happening during a transition through populism, as we call it, is a revolution from a legal rational order type of legitimacy to a traditional and or charismatic type of legitimacy structure. So based on that, that's autocracy. Based on that, there is a autogop that Latin Americanists use to describe swallowing of executive branch of all the other branches of government, plus those institutions I listed there. So executive branch swallows the state with all that ensemble of institutions that I've listed in the previous slide. And under the regime transformation through populism in metastasized advanced stages, that's what happens. The autogop is realized. And particularly after courts and military and police forces are gone, the push is successful. The regime transformation has happened at that point. And after that point, the reorganization of all of these institutions on the basis of the autocratic, traditional and or charismatic organization principle and personalization of all political and public authority takes place within that structure, and recruitment turns from on the basis of merit, as it is the case in a legal, rational legitimacy order, and is replaced with loyalty to the leader. And till no independent institutions remain. If there are questions, I'm going to come back to these, but even the calendar is the same. Since 2008, in all these 4 countries, similar steps were taken, and civil liberties were step by step, and political liberties alongside them were, gotten rid of with all the, state institutions that I've listed there. And rule of law, at the end of that process, was gradually turned into rule by personal arbitrary decrees. So my conclusion is, what is the relevance of First Amendment-based rights to newly consolidated autocracies like Turkey? None, I think. There is no relevance. Because these regimes, and some of which have totalitarian and fascist characteristics, I'm afraid, operate under entirely different models. It's a different operating system with a different type of legitimacy, different type of logic. So civil liberties that are defined as freedom from the state are not protected and cannot be protected under these regimes. The aim of these regimes is total state capture and unification of powers until no checks and balance remain. So they cannot tolerate free media, free press, independent academic institutions, and a freely deliberating public sphere, because these belong to a constitutional democratic regime. Journalists and academics, finally, who defend freedom of expression are among the first to go and serve, therefore, as canaries in the coal mine in countries that are making the transition from democracies to autocracies. They are quickly replaced by a new group of mainstream journalists. The new mainstream is defined by them, academics and ideologues who are loyal servants of the new regime. Thank you for listening.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, Wellesley College, Ms. Catherine Lynch, Karen Soa, and of course Nazan, for organizing this important panel and for inviting us. I salute you, Wellesley. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first of the sort of lectures of the members of the Exile Consortium. And so I hope this encourages all the other members of the consortium to also invite scholars to continue this wonderful tradition. I also recognize the Dr. Aryan Mack, the founder and director of the new University in Exile Consortium, of which I am one of the exiled scholars, and also my own home institution, Columbia University, and its president, Lee Bollinger, who believed in this project from the beginning and also has supported displaced scholars and also students from around the world. I should say the division that I work for, the Columbia Global Centers, announced recently the first ever university scholarship for displaced students in the world. It was written up in the Washington Post, and you can read about that. And so I salute all these universities, and I hope other universities also join them. Secondly, I should say I feel very honored to be among my fellow exiled scholars. This is, as we get to know each other more and more, it's becoming a badge of honor, and it's also becoming a learning opportunity. And it's something that I realize that, obviously we have many things in common, also many things, very different from our backgrounds. But being together, I think, is creating some sense of community amongst people who are displaced from their homes, as I was, and as our colleagues here, Teng and Aisha and Nazan and the others also were. So I want to thank them for being good colleagues, and I look forward to working them in the future. Okay, my presentation today, let me begin with an anecdote. In around 2007, I held a meeting at my house in Tehran. I called about 6 or 7 civil society activists to talk about whether we wanted to start a new NGO. The NGO was going to be a budget watchdog group. Now, I know that sounds very technical, but it was a very simple idea. The idea was that in Iran at the time, there was no civil society organization trying or providing an independent view of what the financial information and the budgets of the government were doing, what money was being spent on, and where money was coming from. I called this group together, who I had been working with for the previous decade on a number of other open society projects. At the time, I was also working for the Open Society Institute, the Soros Foundation. And we talked a lot about whether this was a good idea to do. You should just know it was a very fraught conversation only because it was considered a very risky thing to do. My response was, well, let's go ahead. In other words, there was a lot of trepidation about doing this. My response was, okay, we'll do 2 things to kind of make it easier. One, we'll try to avoid any funding from overseas. And secondly, let's forget about the national budget and let's focus on the municipal budgets, just the cities. There was general approval of this idea, and we went ahead and we did register the NGO. We were refused registration as an NGO, as an NGO, but we found a way to register as a private company. And we did that, and we developed a charter, and we had an idea what we were going to do. We had a very nice plan. I had been working at the time with various groups, international NGOs, a group, for example, called the International Budget Project, which is based in Washington, D.C., and provides a lot of assistance to NGOs that want to start up and build up and learn how to do this watchdog function. And we had a great plan. And about 3 months later, I was arrested, and that put an end to my civic activism at the time. Now, in those years, I had traveled to a number of countries in the region: Pakistan, India, Turkey. Looking at models of NGOs that were doing this. And, we weren't out to find corruption, for example. I mean, that wasn't the first idea. The first idea was that it was just basic information. And I think you'll see now where I'm tying this in with the issue of the First Amendment. But the issue was simply basic information, that the population, civil society, political parties, factions, interest groups might be interested to know where their money was being spent. And I had seen these various models around the region and internationally, and I thought that it could be replicated in Iran. My arrest put a stop to that. My own personal travails are not important right now, What is important is the story now I want to tell, going forward almost 15 years. And the story I want to tell is that ironically, well, surprisingly maybe, what I thought was contradictory to the interests of an authoritarian regime, even a totalitarian regime. And here I'm going to use authoritarianism, although I completely agree with what Aishan said about the importance of maintaining the idea of totalitarianism, but I'm not going to go into that distinction here. At the time, I thought, well, I mean, this is obvious. Of course, why would an authoritarian regime want or welcome information, more information, disclosing information? Fast forward 15 years. What do we see now? What we see now is, I think, a new phenomenon. And I have a sense that what Teng was talking about and what Aishan was talking about and what I want to talk about is understanding the new models of authoritarianism or even quasi-totalitarianism, which seem to be surprising. This is the puzzle. Well, you can see from my title, why authoritarian regimes pursue good governance projects. So what's the puzzle? The puzzle is, why do authoritarian regimes disclose information and seek transparency? So I'm looking at the case of transparency here. Now, when we talk about open government or an open society, we typically associate this with ideas of freedom of information, anti-corruption, and transparency, and accountability. I'm going to get to the question of accountability in a minute. But in other words, the story I want to tell you here is about authoritarian states that in the last 15 years have learnt to be quite adept at using many of the tools that fall under the rubric of good governance. And I'm going to focus on the issue of transparency because that's linked to the idea of First Amendment. Now, obviously here I'm not talking about First Amendment as freedom of expression here, but I am talking about this aspect of freedom of expression, which is, let's say, freedom to information, freedom to have access to information. So I'm going to mention just two examples. One is financial information that the government has and may or may not disclose to the society. And the other is environmental information. And the example, Iran is one example of budgets that are surprising. Iran is a very closed political society. And yet, when researchers go to Iran, they are astonished by the amount of government data that is available on their websites. Actually, you don't have to go to Iran to find them on the websites. Although sometimes you do, because there are some government-related websites with data in them which you can't access from outside the country. But generally speaking, you have, let us say, a surprising degree of access and information in the public domain. Why? If it's a closed society, why would they do that? There's another example, which Teng knows much more than I do. It's a 2008 law in China called the Pollution Index Law, which imposed the central state in China, and of course Teng will correct me if I get the details wrong, but the central state in China in 2008 imposed a law on all provincial governments and all municipalities that they must disclose levels of pollution. They must report on pollution, firms and enterprises and factories that are polluting, and they must disclose them to the public. Puzzle. Why would they do that? Take one of the Central Asian republics, former Soviet Central Asian republics. If you go to Kazakhstan, or if you look at Kazakhstan, as we say in Persian, Kazakhstan, you'll see, this is just a typical example. You'll see a government program dedicated to open government, strengthening civil society, rolling out, and it's not just rhetoric, it's rolling out e-government throughout the cities, throughout the municipalities. They even have an open budget initiative. And yet, Kazakhstan is hardly either trying to pursue liberal democracy or liberalize their politics. So this was the puzzle that had occurred to me that it's worth thinking about, because I think what it's indicating is it's a way of understanding better what Nazan and I had talked about, we had talked about earlier, as electoral authoritarianisms or non-electoral authoritarianisms, as the case may be. I put Turkey here as in a question mark because I haven't done research on Turkey about the issues of transparency and the laws and so on and so forth. So, do you see the point? I mean, the point should be clear. In other words, rather than having a closed political society saying, I don't want to have any information disclosed, now you have regimes which are closed politically, they are authoritarian, they are even moving towards totalitarianism, and yet they use the tools of good governance, the things that all the international agencies work on. When I worked for the World Bank or the UN, this is what we did. We went into these countries, said, these are the tools of good governance, publish your budgets. This is what I was doing in 2007 in Tehran. This is what I was trying to do. So, obviously I don't have time. I only have maximum 8 minutes. I just want to go through a few things just to show. I mean, there is a political scientist, a group of political scientists who have done the most rigorous work available to develop what's called a transparency index. If you can see it, the reference is at the bottom, but that's not important. I've just pulled out here, this was, by the way, just included in the website Our World in Data, but it's based on their very, very rigorous attempt to understand, to really operationalize in a very clear way what transparency is in financial budget data. This is only about government, finances, and economic data. And they do this, by the way, they have a very complicated algorithm, but the idea is very simple. They essentially have taken all the reports that governments around the world give to major international institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. Their algorithm goes through every category and picks out things that are missing or things that are anonymous. And that's how they do it. I was a little shocked to see this chart, by the way, because to see Iran is at the bottom. Iran is here. This is China, and this is Turkey. Now, again, let me emphasize. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to highlight the evident contradiction between some form of transparency and moving towards political autocracy, or even, in other words, I confirm what Ayşen is saying about Turkey, but it's saying that nonetheless, Turkey is disclosing lots of information. Iran was particularly low. If I had seen this map before, I think I probably wouldn't have done what I was trying to do, because I thought, this is a complete no starter. We're way down. We're down somewhere like with Somalia or something. But even China gets this a grade of 1 or something, and that's partly because of this. So let me just wrap up by pulling some ideas together. So the question here is now the link between transparency and what we call accountability. So if we want to be analytical about this, and as a political scientist, what we want to understand is, well, we always seem to assume and we tend to assume that transparency is somehow intimately and closely related with the question of democratic accountability. If I have access to this, it's at least the sine non qua for it, right? It's a sufficient but not necessary condition. What if that's not true? What if our assumption is not right? What if we have to rethink our assumption? Aishan gave a definition of a democratic regime. I would just say here is that for me, I'm going to just focus on elections. All right, so I actually operate with a very minimal definition of democracy, and I can explain what a minimal definition is. It's essentially free and contested elections. That's it. That's what a democracy. That's what would count as a political democracy. In the question and answer, you can challenge me, and I can try to explain more. But in other words, what three things that you do when you have free and contested elections in democracy? You do two things: you authorize, you mandate, and you evaluate. In other words, people authorize their representatives to govern in their name by electing them. They mandate them to do something, which is a response to a platform that politicians say, vote for me because I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. It could either be single issue or it can be a bundle of a platform. And then the final thing you do is you evaluate them. You throw them out at the next election if you don't like them. It's not as minimal as it seems because it's very complicated. For a citizenry to really, really know how to evaluate a politician and whether they really ought to be thrown out or not to be thrown out turns out to be, even in liberal democracies, extremely hard. I'll give you an example from my hometown, New York. They did a survey recently about who in New York City is actually responsible for the disgusting subway we have. Is it the governor or is it the mayor? 50% had absolutely no clue, or 45% I have absolutely no idea. So the question is, if you're going to go to the polls and say, I'm going to express my citizens' right I'm going to vote him out because I'm unhappy with his performance, how do you know? I mean, should you be punishing Cuomo, the governor, or should you be punishing de Blasio, the mayor? It's complicated even where there are guaranteed liberal rights and civil rights and so forth. Electoral authoritarian regimes, however, not only use elections, so this is the point I'm trying to make, is not only use elections to consolidate their power, they now can use tools of good governance, like transparency, to do it. I'm going to skip this and just go to my conclusion. Just very briefly, there are a number of reasons why, which I don't go through here. Actually, I didn't put it in the chart, in the slides. I mean, why would China, for example, why would the central government impose on municipalities to disclose information? Well, one reason is because when you have protests against environmental pollution in a town or in a province, the central government doesn't like that. And there is something that political scientists and in the business literature is called a principal agent problem. It's monitoring. I mean, if you've ever hired someone to do something, even if you're being hired as a faculty member to do something, or you hire someone to do something, how do you know they're actually doing what you want them to do? You have to monitor them. And that's costly. The way in which the central government can keep municipalities in line who don't listen to the central government in China is by making them actually collect and publicize this data so that, and in fact I might come back to this, so that the central government can use people to pressure the subnational government. That's basically how the central government keeps the subnational government, the city, in line. Otherwise, the city government in China has only one overriding objective, and that is to maximize GDP. But Now that they're creating an environmental crisis, how does the central government get them to focus on environmental issues? They can't do it directly because they don't have the bureaucratic power. So what they do is actually they kind of publish this and get the civil society groups to protest against the municipalities. That's just one example of how, it's nothing to do about protecting liberal rights. It's not about protecting the rights of opposition political parties or the rights of individuals to free speech, or no. There are accountability relations in which transparency can be used to further the interests of interested powers. I'm up. Let me just conclude. So we have here, I think, questions about what's going on in these different types of non-democratic regimes. We have electoral authoritarian regimes, Iran and Turkey. That is to say, regimes that are not democratic but use elections to consolidate monopoly power. That's one tool. You have non-electoral authoritarianisms like China, and they can use that too. And so the general conclusions is the assumed connections between transparency and accountability are not straightforward at all. We need to research them. We need to look at case studies. And so my reflection after all these years is, well, autocratic regimes can outdo us, can outdo civil society activists. They can outmaneuver civil society activists. They can use those very tools of good governance not to deepen or introduce democratic norms and rights and accountability, right, through those three mechanisms, but to achieve technocratic objectives without undermining their own power. I think this is an issue we should put on the agenda for research. We should keep our eyes wide open and look around about how, the new shape of these, unfortunately, increasingly numerous authoritarian regimes. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We meet weekly online, and still every time every time we speak, I learn something new from them. So this is very exciting for me at the same time. So let's move on to the questions. We also have an online audience, as I said in the beginning. The New University and Exile Consortium fellows are also joining us online. If they have any questions, Shingi is going to read us the questions. But shall we give the first? And I would like to salute them, both Arian, Dick, Judith, and our fellows over there. Shall we give the first question to the audience here, maybe, and then get the second question from the online audience?
I have a question for Dr. Key. Sorry, the last name too difficult for me.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm very interested by your study, but there's also a very important question for me in my mind. When you said transparency, you mean disclose the information by the government. But there's a question. If someone discloses a lot of information but it's fake, it's intentionally make it fake, can we call it transparency? Maybe not.
No.
Okay, so you have example about the Chinese pollution index. And a lot of people in China know, no matter central government or local government, the index is fake. We are lucky because we have someone in China. They have the resource, can test it, and they are brave enough to public. And more luckily, the Chinese government cannot block it because political reason. This group people from United States Embassy, they test it, then they publish it in their website. The number is much bigger then the government public. So I think that that's something you need to think about it. Also, that happened also in this disaster right now in China. In the early time of December, the Wuhan government officer also disclosed the situation of the coronavirus. But in the early time of December, in about 1 week, every day they said no new case, no new case. Why? Because in that week, the party, the government have an important political meeting. And it's a hobby, it's a tradition in China. When that happens, they deny all bad news. And people who disclose the bad news could be in jail. So that's, I think, something important for transparency when we talk about it. Thank you.
Can I make a comment? Hello? Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think obviously you can have fake news and you can have fabricated information. The argument, and for that you would need to have studies done. I mean, there are 2 or 3 studies which are done by Chinese and also Western scholars, looking very carefully at the whole data, the PITI data set. I didn't see them accuse that data set of being a fabrication. But the point I'm making is that, I'm assuming that authoritarian states are free to do that, right? I mean, because they don't have an institutionalized checks and balances. But the point, I think the thesis that I was trying to put forward was that even when the data is not fake, it can play a function in consolidating and strengthening authoritarian power. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Yes, the human rights situation in China has been deteriorating very rapidly for the past year, especially since Xi Jinping took his office in 2013. The roundup of human rights lawyers, the more censorship on internet, and many non-government organizations have been shut down. And I promoted the rights defense movement in early 2000, and harshly speaking, that's during Hu Jintao era between 2003 and 2013, and we could have the space to develop the human rights movement, the legal professions and NGOs, but now many NGOs were stopped, and even NGOs focusing on labor rights, environment, and education, poverty that were stopped. It's the reason I have written a few articles to analyze why Xi Jinping cracked down on civil society so harshly. It's Communist Party, not only Xi Jinping. I don't think it's Xi Jinping himself that turned China back toward cultural revolution, the Mao-style totalitarian system. It is the collective choice, to a certain extent, of the Communist Party to decide more personal dictatorship, and the reason is the achievement. It's achievement of the human rights movement and the civil society in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era, and then the Communist Party see it as an urgent threat to the one-party rule, and then that's their reaction is tighten its control, its total control on society. So I don't know how to react to the situation, but yeah, the NGOs and human rights activists in China are facing very, very difficult time. So actually, I'm writing an article like the China miracle and governance failure. So it's so I may have some disagreement with your good governance. Yes, of course, China's economic miracle is not deniable. For the past 3 decades, China has become the second largest economy, and China's GDP has increased like 90 times comparing to 1978. And almost every Chinese living standard has been increased, and that's true. That's a great achievement. But behind the China miracle, there are like pollution, the rampant corruption, and the human rights violations, and many people haven't realized that one of the most important reasons of the China's rapid economic growth is low human rights disadvantage. The cheap labor, no right to strike, that no independent labor union, and that make the products made in China so cheap, and then China is one of the not only the least free countries, but also the most unequal country. The Gini coefficient. So the gap between the rich and the poor is one of the biggest in the world. So that's one thing. The so-called China miracle is not so admirable, and the most achievement of the economic growth occupied by the privileged family. If you go to the remote villages, their lives never changed for 50 years, 60 years, but simply speaking, first, China has, if we focus on economic growth, we may conclude that China has somehow good governance. The competition between local governments is very important. So they are really want to attract investment, want to increase the GDP, and so they do have good governance in terms of technology and investment, and the market economy like that, But if we take a look at what's happening for the past months, the Wuhan coronavirus, we can conclude that it's a total governance failure. The cover up, the postpone of the treatment, and to quarantine 60 million people, and to arrest arbitrarily those who have no face masks. So if Chinese government didn't cover up the truth in the early stage, and then this coronavirus won't be spread to this uncontrollable. So I think it's a governance failure behind it.
Could I make a comment?
Yeah.
I'd like to respond because this raises the question. I mentioned about a minimal definition of democracy. The importance of that, I think, is related to your question. For many, many decades, political scientists, scholars have tried to see whether the political system that we call democracy, which I defined as being authorizing, mandating, and evaluating through free and fair contested elections, whether that can be found to be associated with any other attribute of a society. So the oldest question the political scientists have looked at is whether, in fact, let's say, democracy as a political system is associated with higher levels of economic quality of life. Does it lead to economic development? Are democratic societies richer, for example? 40 years of empirical research has given us a tentative answer. The answer is no. So let me read you just a brief conclusion. Quote, the extent of income inequality, even to mention the question of inequality. So there was all these things we were wondering whether you have a democratic system, whether it creates a lot of other goods. Are people happier? Are they healthier? Are they richer? Are they X, Y, Z, all these things, right? Turns out pretty much no. It doesn't have a lot of... The extent of income inequality does not differ much across political regimes. At every level of per capita income, the extent of inequality is not lower in democracies than in autocracies. A second result, finding. Contrary to all expectations, fears, and hopes, democracy does not have much of an effect on correcting for the inequality generated by the unequal distribution of property and the inequality generated by markets. So the question then is, I mean, you do ask, I think, a very appropriate normative question. Is it better? Well, to answer that question, we have to understand what we mean by better. Obviously, the data is in until we have other data sets which show that democracies are not by themselves. They don't make you richer. They don't make you more equal. They may not even make you more healthy. They may not even make you more happy. So what's the point? And I think that's the answer. And I think for me, the answer is in that tripartite model that I made about authorizing, mandating, and evaluating. Actually, it turns out, this is maybe a little complicated, but even the data we have from 60 years of empirical research on electoral behavior in the West, this is in the United States, is that it turns out mandating and evaluating, there's not a lot to say for it. People have, to quote a very prominent political theorist, most people haven't got the foggiest clue what's going on. They don't know, they don't know. It's very hard to figure out the candidate that's telling you, the one you really want, except in some very big micro things. Is it emotion? Is it can it be manipulated by rhetoric? You see what I mean? And then in terms of evaluating, very tough. I spend my life, I'm paid to, sit down, and who has time to sit down and pore through the congressional record and see, who... In reality, that's hard. I'm saying so, that leaves the first one. Authorizing. So really, it's a kind of existential position. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of saying, the people rule and no one else. Even though we may not choose the policies we want, because we have no idea amongst, how to bundle, these complicated. We may not know how to throw out the people we don't like for the right reason, but the very fact that we can throw out, we choose who governs us, seems to be the core existential value of a democratic society. Does it make us less unequal? No. Does it make us richer? No. May not even make us healthier, but it makes us safer. It makes it, so arguably, The one thing it does is it prevents the government from arbitrarily killing you and imprisoning you as a routine matter.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I don't need it.
No, but
So my question, the Professor Ayşen Çandaş, during your lecture you said that political science have failed to predict the current political situation. So based on your statement, what were the missing elements or factors to predict the current situation in these countries you mentioned, or what were some new emerging factors or elements and reshape the political direction of these countries, especially the Turkey in your area of expertise? Okay.
Thank you so much for the question. The technical answer to that question is there are certain things that separate authoritarianisms from totalitarianisms. Authoritarianism is a stable kind of system in the sense that it is satisfied when people sit at home and do not participate in politics. So I think an authoritarian regime, the typical definition of that is one which pushes people to become apolitical. And as long as they keep quiet and sit at home and do not protest anything, that is a stable political authoritarian regime. Totalitarian regime, on the other hand, of course, there are various theories about that since 1930s. But I'm going to talk about the parts where Arendt, Neumann, Frankfurt School people, Juan Linz, people who studied those regime types agree on. There are a few important distinctions between the two. The first one, which I take to be particularly important, is in a totalitarian regime, the difference between private and public sphere disappears. And this means that alongside the vision of a creation of a new society, new man, even the private lives of people, how women are going to reproduce, how many kids they are going to have, what should they think when they are educating their children? What kind of things they should be eating? Their private life is very much infiltrated by the political ideology, which is the central thing in that regime. So the distinction between private and public completely disappears in a completely totalitarian regime. Whereas in authoritarianism, it doesn't care what you do at home as long as you do not protest in the street or, do something that troublemakers would do. That's one. Second difference that's Arendt, of course. Terror under totalitarianism is not for punishment, is not for keeping people silent. Terror turns into something that the regime does for its own sake. So terror separates itself from its rationalizable objectives in a state and turns itself into something like a display, like a public theater. It is there to make people fear. And which brings me to the third distinction that Juan Linz, in turn, emphasizes between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Under totalitarianism, it's not sufficient for the regime that you keep quiet and sit at home. You have to actively cheer and clap and applaud and transform your feelings 24 hours a day cheering that regime. It wants mass mobilization, in other words, in the streets. Think of 1930s huge gatherings under Hitler, you know, stadiums of people, or Mussolini, you know. It requires that kind of mass participation that is compulsory, and people have to cheer. If you're standing in that mass movement and you're just, you know, you're not smiling or clapping, that's not acceptable. So mass mobilization is the third one. So depending on these, if we're clear about those distinctions, I think by looking at the policies that these countries implement, we can understand why some policies are iffy from the perspective of totalitarianism. Is it becoming totalitarian? We can understand if it's trying to reshape, engineer, socially engineer family life, for example. We can understand that there's something wrong, there is worsening. I don't know whether I responded to your question. Okay.
We have one online question coming from fellow Ahmet Çoymak, who is a consortium fellow at Barnard College.
Thank you, Nizar. So Ahmed begins by giving a comment. So he says, I'm thrilled each time that I'm meeting with consortium colleagues. I'm learning a lot about a way of living people in my country, so the way of life that people in my country have and the rest of the world. So I thank everyone involved in making this event possible for us. It's very exciting. Regarding my question, some of the autocratic countries that you mentioned in your talks call themselves democratic societies. Some of them do not even need to define themselves as democratic. So my question is, what makes differences or similarities for totalitarian regimes if they call themselves democratic societies, both in national and international politics, especially regarding transparency, checks and balances, and freedom of the press and academics? I don't know if that was clear.
You want to go first? You want to go first?
Yeah, I think first, Chinese government sometimes says it's better. Its system, its political system is better than Western-style democracy. But interestingly, if we look at the Constitution, the words of the Constitution, China is not a democratic. So even in its own Constitution, in the article, the second article, it says China is a democratic dictatorship. So it's a democratic dictatorship. Anyway, it's kind of oxymoron, so I like to make further comments about your question, like the China's the good aspects of China's system or development, and also yours. Yes, of course, it's not necessary for democratic countries to make you richer or making the country more equal. But Amartya Sen argued that a democratic system can avoid the humanitarian disaster, a great famine like what we have seen in Mao era China and North Korea, and then that's the advantage of democracy, and second, even though democracy doesn't make a country more wealthier, but is still desirable because money is not everything. We have to focus. We have to pay attention to, if not prioritize, freedom, dignity, like that. Yeah, and last one, the legitimacy performance legitimacy, because in modern society the only legitimate system is democracy. So authoritarian system or totalitarian system cannot have a meaningful political legitimacy, even though they want performance legitimacy, but it's not legitimacy, so the problem of political legitimacy is always a problem in authoritarian totalitarian state.
Yeah, one comment I just want to make. When I said like better or it's getting better, the people's life is getting better. I'm not saying like the measurement is making them money. That's not my point. My point is like people's basic needs: food, shelter. That's the basic needs. Like I say, I've seen people in China because my grandparents, they are from very rural area in China. So in the past, when I was little, I would visit them. I say that people's basic needs, like for food, for shelter, even that basic needs, they cannot match that need. But I've seen in the past 30 years, people's lives getting better, not making more money, but their basic needs are getting met. So in that term, I think I say life is getting better in China. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So simply speaking, we should Chinese government attributed to the economic growth, the better living standards to the political system, to Communist Party, but we shouldn't. It is not the Communist Party make your life easier or like make more money for you. It is the Chinese people. So we may even argue that if China is a democratic country, then the economic growth and the living standard, the happiness of the people may be like even better. So it is this kind of political, the one party rule that deprived Chinese people of their fundamental freedom.
Well, I wanted to just make a comment about, but before that, I should say, I'm sympathetic to your comment. I should tell you that one of the formative experiences as an adolescent was reading The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. I don't know whether you know that novel. I mean, it's about the famine. I mean, it describes in very, very gruesome detail the famine at the early part of the 20th century in China, and it was harrowing for me. It's almost as I can, and I have heard in things that I've read that senior Chinese politicians will say, we're doing all this so that we never experience that again. However, I would just say, when you say basic needs are not being met, I think, I'm a bit of a cultural relativist. So, I mean, if a people decides that, an individual freedom is not part of their basic needs, I don't know. It's not up to me to decide it for it not. But I agree with Teng. I mean, you could increase the basket of basic needs to say absolutely material basic needs are important. But the question of establishment, authorization. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of saying, I am an individual with dignity. I am a member of this community. I am a member with at least a tiny bit of voice. That's what democracy gives you. It may not give you exactly the policies you want and so forth, but what it does say is that at least I have a voice in the laws under which I live. And there is a tradition in the West about the happy slave, which is used as a criticism of saying, well, you could have a very, very well treated slave, with everything they want. So, and that's a form of criticism. But I think a lot of this comes to cultural history. I should just say, in terms of, in response to Ahmed, about the difference between liberalism and democracy, or modern democracy and totalitarianism. It's only very recent, in human history, that the idea of democracy has come to be associated with freedom. I mean, for 2,000 years, maybe 3,000 years, and we all read in Aristotle and Plato particularly, everyone knew democracy was the worst threat to individual liberty. democracy that was the rule of the mob. Only in the 19th century, I mean, in other words, for all these thousands of years, people knew that, if you want to maintain freedom, individual freedom, which for many, many centuries meant freedom of private property. But if you want to maintain that, the last thing you want is democracy. In other words, majority rule. That's what, the rule of the mob. Only in the 19th century did liberal democracy emerge as a discourse in which people understood this to be somehow they could converge. And now it's being confused. And I think what we're seeing, if I'm right in what Aishan is saying, and so we're saying, what we're saying is we need to sort of disentangle this again. That is to say, you could have majorities, right? I mean, what is democracy after all? It's majority rule. So if a majority in the United States decides to disenfranchise a sexual minority or an ethnic minority, why is that not democracy? That's what happened in Iran. The reason why it's not democracy in the West is because we don't really mean democracy, we mean liberal democracy. That means that there are individual rights which set a floor below which majorities cannot fall, cannot decide. Now, those of you who are still firing on all cylinders at 6 o'clock in the afternoon should be able to pick up a paradox here. And the paradox, of course, is, well, where do those minority rights come from? And they can only come from majorities. So there's a paradox here in which majorities have to say, all right, we somehow will agree not to disenfranchise the losers. We won't imprison the losers. We won't kill them. We'll let them try to get us out of office 4 years from now. So that's my response to Ahmed, that is that, in fact, totalitarian democracy is not an oxymoron. You could have 90% of the people deciding that they want to completely subjugate a minority.
I mean, I'll just briefly say, when we say constitutional democracy, we're referring to the liberal institutions and constitutionalism that emerged as a result of Holocaust and Geneva Convention, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So 1948 onwards, the kinds of institutions that were established. So obviously, we're not talking about ancient Greek city-states where slavery and disenfranchisement of women was normal. So when we talk about democracy today in 21st century, even if we're going to get rid of constitutional democracy altogether, and I'm beginning to see the possibility for that, unfortunately. But at least we should understand that it was a particular institutional ensemble at the same time. So we can't really. Why is there a need, if we are, say, cultural relativists? Why is there a need to try to create, say, transparency index, or to try to make free and fair elections? These are also very, Western constructs, if we begin to extend that kind of thinking, it seems to me. So I think it's important to understand that constitution means whoever comes to power, whatever they can do with that political authority is limited by certain rules that apply regardless of who comes to power. And that's always for the public interest. That's always for the interest of the most vulnerable people in that population. So I think, I felt the need to put that on the table. It's my last word. Thank you.
So before we conclude, we just have a couple of minutes. Can I use my privilege as the moderator to ask Aishan a question so that we don't leave the room all depressed, maybe? So you ended on the note where state is captured, everyone is silenced. Your very existence here is a great sign of hope for all these shows that you all did something, went beyond your way, and then you were persecuted in the end. That's the worst part. But where are we going to find hope in here for another type of regime change this time?
I mean, of course, everybody else should also respond to that question. But from my perspective, I don't think, regardless of culture and political history, people's need and basic need to have an equal voice, to have an equal dignity, to have to participate in the decisions that are made on their behalf, I think those needs will not disappear regardless of where we go. And freedom from torture, I really think that those rights that are included within what we call civil liberties and political liberties have a universal relevance. But that's how I am. I mean, everybody is going to find hope elsewhere, I think. But I think as a result of that repression, people will reclaim their rights. They'll rediscover their rights. So I'm very hopeful about that. Is a dialectic.
One sentence. So I don't think the rights of the minority are from the majority. So the universal, the fundamental human rights is from the God, from nature. Everyone is born to have that basic human rights, and I think that's the hope. If your rights, if your dignity is violated, and then you'll be angry, and some of them, if possible, they'll resist, and that's the hope.
Are there any more questions? Is it very short? Because we need to conclude in a minute. Okay.
So, Ashan, you mentioned how there's no relevance of First Amendment rights to autocratic regimes because they operate on a different logic and different model. Can you elaborate more on this type of logic and model that autocratic regimes operate under?
I was, for example, thinking about how Kian's presentation about accountability and transparency applied to the Turkish case. I think the more autocratic it got, starting with 2010 when the chart Kian showed us ended, precisely since that period, it's less transparent, more corrupt, and public funds, and that's what I meant when I said autocracy means personalization and privatization of political authority. It's as if all the funds that are collected through taxation are the president's private budget. And he decides where it's going to be allocated, for what, at which amount, and he doesn't have to explain any of that anywhere. So pretty much about everything else too, policy decisions are made not in the parliament, but at the palace. So everything is more and more centralized as days go by. I don't know whether that responds to your question.
So on that note, I think we can conclude. Thank you so much for being here this late. I would like to thank the Freedom Project and the Provost Office for making this event possible. And I also would like to add that it's very reassuring to see that the college community takes a stance, public stance, in defending academic freedoms. And hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for being here.